Children are so innocent, they don't know about adults molesting them. Their world to them is safe until somebody shows them differently. And then someone comes along and steals their innocence. Mine was stolen in the home. But now, on the streets, they're not safe.
How old were you when you met Dr. Alfred Kinsey?
It was probably in 1943 or so. I didn't know who he was. All I knew was that my dad was very excited about taking me there for an interview.
You ask, what would the American public say if they actually understood the background to what became the sexual revolution, a sexual psychopath?
Do you ever remember your father molesting you with a stopwatch?
Yes.
If the American public knew that Kinsey worked with a Nazi pedophile and encouraged his rapes of children and possibly even and eventually the murder of this one little girl.
You and I are going to be doing some experiments.
This man was the singularly most important individual in the decriminalization of every single law that we had ever had that protected women and children.
When America was founded, it said that our values were based on the Judeo-Christian teachings of the Bible. Andrew Jackson once said, "That book is the rock on which our republic rests." But through the 20th century, the view of America as a Christian nation has been hotly debated.
Whatever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation.
This nation was founded primarily on Christian principles.
Which claim should Americans believe? And by what standard do we determine the moral compass for what is right and wrong in our society? George Washington, in his inaugural address of 1789, said, "The propitious smiles of heaven cannot be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained." Among our once traditional values was the protection of women and children, once considered a sacred duty among all men. But now, under the guise of so-called liberty, the care of our most vulnerable has been compromised. We can only wonder what the father of our country might say if he could see what is happening to the children of America today and the reasons behind it. Many of America's children are disappearing. According to the Office of Juvenile Justice, a child goes missing every 40 seconds in the United States. While many of these children are recovered, it is estimated that more than 58,000 of them are abducted by non-family members each year. Parents are continually in fear for their child's safety, even in front of their own home. Predators seem to roam the streets of America like never before, searching for prey to carry out their unthinkable desires. Many of our laws are named after raped and murdered children, whose memories echo through our courts crying for justice. But still, the problem only seems to get worse.
And we also see in a lot of these kidnapping and death cases recently by sex offenders that your child can be lost in just an instant.
The faces of children who have been lost continue to haunt us as a society, while watching their parents grieve has become part of a national nightmare. Meanwhile, the images of the sex offenders, the men responsible for these horrors, fills us with fear and loathing. And if a child survives their abuse, they often lead troubled lives, haunted by the memory of what they've endured.
It is awful. Those kids shouldn't be subjected to this. That's awful. It scars them psychologically forever. It affects their lives.
Well, some of the experts say that once a pedophile, always a pedophile, that recidivism is 80 or 90%, if not more.
The United States of America has basically become a pedophile's playground. Jessica Lunsford's father, he said, you know, wake up, America. Your child could be next. And sadly, a lot of people want to turn away from the evidence. They want to turn their heads like the proverbial ostrich with its head in the sand because they don't want to face what's going on until they're forced to face it because it becomes their child.
Part of the confusion is over why many of our judges send repeat sex offenders back into our neighborhoods, knowing it is simply a matter of time before they strike again. Can the reason be that these same judges are compromised by their own sexual addiction?
We know that the judges they're human. They're like everybody else.
Cases of judges who are compromised by porn are documented across the country. But the license for such behavior may have been issued in 1970, when Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas and retired Justice Arthur Goldberg wrote articles for Playboy Magazine. But why would an association with a soft porn magazine like Playboy be cause for concern? And how could it pertain to the world of pedophiles? The disturbing answer to this question as our history of this movement unfolds. In 1990, the American Bar Association reported that 80% of convicted child molesters plea bargain and serve no prison time. This statistic undoubtedly put known pedophiles back on the streets in record numbers. But this was a few years prior to the widespread use of the internet, where the most extreme forms of sexual perversion, and especially child pornography, have become a major factor in conditioning the next generation of sexual predators. In 2006, the law firm of Estee and Bomberger reported that the number of victims of childhood sexual abuse and molestation grows each year. This horrific crime is directly tied to the growth of pornography on the internet. They went on to say that research reveals that 77% of child molesters of boys and 87% of child molesters of girls admitted imitating the sexual behavior they had seen in pornography they had watched.
Basically, people that watch porn act it out. And so with the pedophilia, sure, people are going to see it and they're going to act it out.
Because of the huge impact that the porn industry has had, conservative estimates say the highest service revenue on the internet, over $3 billion a year in income just on internet porn. And those are very conservative figures. I'm sure they're much higher, with between 500 and 700 new sites coming on a day on the internet.
The increase in child sexual abuse cannot be denied. We are massacring our children. It is a holocaust against our children.
I've prosecuted murders, I've prosecuted child molesters, and I'll tell you, I get more up in the air when I was prosecuting about the child molester than the murder. I'm not condoning murder, it's not the right thing to do, but it's over. The person's gone, sad. But that poor little boy or girl, they're messed up for life. I mean, they're going to be carrying that baggage forever, and we as a society better start addressing that.
Researchers argue that America's current problem with sexual predators is the fallout from the sexual revolution, a movement said to be inspired by the late Alfred Kinsey and his famous Kinsey Reports, first published in 1948. According to the conservative organization Human Events, the Kinsey Report is listed among the top 10 most harmful books of the 19th and 20th centuries. Number 1 on their list was the Communist Manifesto that inspired the deaths of more than 100 million people in the 20th century alone. Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf that helped to bring about the Holocaust was listed at number 2, while the quotations from Chairman Mao, who founded Communist China, was number 3. At number 4, as the first American title on the list, was the Kinsey Reports. Sexual behavior in the human male, followed by sexual behavior in the human female, which, when first released, was likened to dropping an atom bomb on American society. In 1989, a report from the National Research Council published a statement that American society can be divided into 2 categories, the pre-Kinsey and post-Kinsey eras. How could one man's influence come to define our culture and produce what some consider the most harmful book in American history?
It would find its way into every aspect of our decision-making in our lives.
Dr. Judith Reisman is renowned for her expertise on the damaging influence of pornography. She has testified repeatedly before the U.S. Congress. Her research has been used by the FBI and by governments throughout the Western world when determining their policies on obscenity. She is author of the book, Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, in which she details the devastating impact of Alfred Kinsey in America, an influence she believes is behind the growing number of sexual predators who seem to come from all walks of life.
Teachers, doctors, lawyers, judges, people are being caught right and left, sacrificing their lives and their families' lives to their addictions to child pornography. How do you think it happened? It did not start today. It started back with Kinsey, and who then kicked off what has become today's horror show. Child sexual abuse, rape, torture. People say, well, you can't track that all to Kinsey. Well, you can track enough of it to make an awfully frightening case.
While Dr. Reisman's view may seem extreme, her evidence is disturbing, the results of which are so often reported in our nightly news.
35-year-old convicted sex offender Bradley Meinhardt was sentenced to just 1 to 3 years in prison for sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl in East Penn, and the guy had a prior.
Here's the suspect right here, Joseph Edward Duncan. He has a long history of sexual aggression.
Here's Larry Don McQuaid, the 41-year-old former school bus driver who's confessed to sexually abusing more than 200 children.
I was able to manipulate parents and children alike, that I was such a nice guy that I wouldn't do something as wrong and disgusting and as that. I consider myself a demon. It's too dangerous for me to be on the street.
Should he be released?
We tried to protest parole. Unfortunately, as I said, the statute requires his release.
I didn't know that the average sex offender predator molests 100 children. I mean, that just makes my outrage even more.
For years, Americans have wondered why repeat sex offenders so often receive light prison sentences only to be released back into society. According to Dr. Reisman, the answer is Alfred Kinsey.
The laws were changed based upon his fraudulent data, and he was directly involved in those changes. Kinsey went state by state. I have his testimony in California in 1949, telling a committee that was about to toughen the sex laws and toughen up about the laws to protect children because there'd been a murder of 2 little girls. He goes to California to testify in 1949 that you should release everybody, that pedophiles and pederasts did not repeat their crimes, that parole was absolutely critical. That would reduce our sex crimes. The committee believes him. They reduce all of our sex crimes. They parole people, and they haven't stopped.
When the Kinsey Report was first released, the famous ACLU lawyer Morris Ernst wrote that virtually every page of the Kinsey Report touches on the legal code. He told the legal profession that no bar association, law school journal, or lawyers' committee can consider sex laws without the Kinsey study. According to Westlaw, the most widely used legal database, between the years 1982 to 2000, there were approximately 650 citations to Alfred Kinsey.
The model penal code that was adopted just after 1955 was based on Kinsey's research.
This is a flow chart I put together to describe how the Kinsey research gutted American laws. Through the American Law Institute, ALI, the American Law Institute Model Penal Code, 1955. That was where protections were then removed for women and children from American law system. The U.S. justice system from 1948 to today, that's what this is about.
After publishing his reports, Kinsey traveled the country, giving lectures at universities and testifying before lawmakers. He was received as the leading scientific expert in the world on human sexuality. In particular, he discussed laws concerning sex offenders and the education of children.
Of children, he said 100% are orgasmic from birth. Therefore, children can benefit from sex with adults and even incest, which is illegal, so we need to lower the age of consent. He was working toward making everything legal, but that's all right. Children need early explicit school sex education since they're sexual from birth, which was illegal at the time, now it's everywhere. They need masturbation and hetero and homosexual acts to be taught to them, which was illegal, and now it's being taught. And about parole, Kinsey said that sex offenders rarely repeat sex crimes, therefore all sex offenders should be paroled, which is exactly what started to take place.
Part of Kinsey's defense of pedophiles was that children were not really harmed by sexual contact with adults. Therefore, it made no sense to incarcerate pedophiles for lengthy prison terms.
1950, Rockefeller funded the American Law Institute Model Penal Code. 1952, a Harvard Law Review called for a code to change our sex laws in accordance with what Kinsey had objectively found. And then in 1955, the code was created and sent out to all legislators in the country via these important people, judge, lawyers, sociologists, lawyers, and so forth. And from there, that went, the ALI model, the sex offenses section, sent to states all over the country, adopted all or in part beginning in 1956 here and moving on to Illinois, to Minnesota and so forth, and all other states of the Union.
As Dr. Reisman noted, the Model Penal Code was financed by the Rockefeller Foundation. Not coincidentally, the Rockefeller Foundation also financed the research of Alfred Kinsey. In the 1950s, a congressional committee was formed under Congressman B. Carroll Reese to investigate the influence of the large tax-exempt foundations, including Rockefeller.
There was a huge concern at the time, in the 1950s, that the foundations were now being run by people with a strikingly strident a libertarian or liberal agenda, which resisted and resented the Judeo-Christian way of life.
The late Norman Dodd was the director of research for the Reese Committee. In an interview recorded shortly before his death, Dodd stated that part of what the committee had learned was that the objective of the great foundations was to remove America from the values on which she was built and to do so through the education system.
What we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations, this Carnegie Endowment story and the Ford Foundation and the Guggenheim and the Rockefeller Foundation, all working in harmony toward the control of education in the United States.
Dodd's testimony becomes an important issue when considering the direct impact of Kinsey's research on sex education in America. While the Reese Committee investigated many programs funded by the foundations, when it came to Kinsey's research, they were vehemently opposed by the late Congressman Wayne Hayes.
That's established quite well in Renee Wormser's book on foundations, their power and influence, a book that no American who wants to understand what happened to our country should be without.
Renee Wormser was the lawyer for the Reese Committee. In his book, Wormser writes that the committee had dug up some significant material about foundation support of the Kinsey projects. This brought Mr. Hayes into a steaming rage, he says, and he asked to see our entire Kinsey file. It was produced for him, and he angrily declared to Mr. Dodd that we were to go no further with this particular investigation. contending that every member of Congress would be against our doing so. Mr. Hayes stated emphatically to Mr. Dodd that he would oppose any further appropriation to our committee unless the Kinsey investigation were dropped. Wormser writes that as a result, the valuable material in our Kinsey file never saw the light of day. What was it in the Kinsey file that provoked such a response from a U.S. congressman? As we move forward, consider that the Kinsey data was partly paid for by the American taxpayers, who continue to fund the Kinsey Institute to this day.
There's more going on in that institute. They have covered up so much.
Some believe that if Kinsey's research had been exposed in the 1950s, the information might have sparked a second American Revolution. What was in the Kinsey file, and does that information continue to influence or even haunt America? Through the 1930s and 40s, Alfred Kinsey conducted thousands of interviews with both men and women, taking, as he called it, their sexual histories. The purpose of his study was to discover the sexual behavior of the average man and woman in America at the time. Kinsey was a professor at the University of Indiana in Bloomington. Despite his Christian upbringing, he would come to reject the Judeo-Christian belief of his family in favor of Darwinian philosophy, accepting the idea that man is simply a more highly evolved animal.
Kinsey, as a zoologist and biologist, considered, rightly, that humans are animals, although lots of people hate to admit that.
Kinsey's expertise had been the study of the gall wasp. He spent years collecting and cataloging thousands of them. Noticing the countless differences in these insects, he concluded that such variations must also be true of human behavior. Upon interviewing thousands of volunteer subjects, Kinsey not only recorded data, but drew certain conclusions about the sexual behavior of men, women, and children. But was his research that of an objective scientist, or the intentional manipulation of a sexual deviant who wanted to remake the American male and female in his own image?
Kinsey has legitimized the free sex revolution, and he did it through academia. But what's interesting, according to research that's been done on this gentleman, this guy was a pervert himself.
Kinsey's critics claim that his real motive was not science, but a social agenda to change the morality of America, something admitted by Kinsey biographer Jonathan Gathorne Hardy.
It's abundantly clear as you go into it that there was a very large social agenda. He didn't just want a greater tolerance and sanity from understanding the facts of sex. He thought it was quite monstrous the way homosexuals were regarded. In general, there was a very powerful social agenda, which is perfectly plain when you read the book, from the polemic right the way through it, and was perfectly plain at the time to the people who worked with him.
When the Kinsey Reports were published, they shocked the country, because the behavior that Kinsey described did not at all represent what most Americans believed about their own sexuality. Consider that Kinsey was documenting the behavior of the World War II era, those that Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. Among Kinsey's more controversial claims is the idea that 10% of American men were fully homosexual for at least 3 years of their life, while 37% of American men had engaged in homosexual contact to the point of orgasm at least once in their lives. Later studies would place those numbers much lower, with only 1% of men in the U.S. claiming to be homosexual, while only 2 to 3% admitted to some kind of homosexual activity in their lifetime. Nevertheless, Kinsey's data was seized upon by men like Harry Hay, who read the Kinsey Reports, left his wife and children, and went on to found the gay rights revolution that began in the 1960s. To this day, the gay rights movement is largely based on Kinsey's data. Kinsey also reported high levels of premarital sex, claiming that 69% of American men had visited prostitutes and that 50% of married men were guilty of adultery. Again, a later study done as early as 1960 by Phyllis and Eberhard Kronhausen would find that the levels of sexual promiscuity among males were much lower than Kinsey had reported. According to his fellow researchers, the reason for this dramatic difference is because Kinsey manipulated the data, including men from America's prisons, as part of the regular male population.
He wrote that he found 1,300 to 1,400 sex offenders that he used as his normal male population. What?
In addition to the convicted sex offenders, Kinsey included regular prisoners who were serving time for other offenses, along with 199 sexual psychopaths, all mixed together as part of the regular male population and presented to the American people as the average American male. In this interview for the documentary titled 1 in 10, listen as Paul Gebhardt, who was one of Kinsey's co-authors and a member of his original team, admits to the high percentage of prisoners and their impact on Kinsey's data.
With these poorer, lower educational level samples. And when I say poorer, they had, for example, 55% were prison. 55% were prison. And I think that has a definite effect. We know we didn't have enough non-prison people to do much of a comparison, but he didn't do a comparison. He simply took the prison people he got and used them with that less than college educated sample. But the trouble was, by, you might say, emphasizing the less than college educated sample, he introduced a lot of errors into the data.
With America's prison population presented as the average male, is it any wonder that laws would be changed to accommodate sexual predators while failing to protect women and children? To create high levels of homosexual activity, Kinsey also went into Chicago's underground, into gay bars and homosexual bathhouses, and incorporated the radically gay population into his regular male data, along with bootleggers, gamblers, male prostitutes, ne'er-do-wells, pimps, thieves, and hold-up men, all this according to his own report. Kinsey used similar tactics to redefine the average American female.
They use this picture all the time to try and show the American public that they were interviewing average American women, all right? Except that this was their secretary, okay? This is a secretary at the Kinsey Institute, and they would always label her as though she was just some average American woman. Sometimes they put Kinsey in the picture interviewing her, and sometimes they put him. And now, after I exposed that in one of my books, the Kinsey Institute has now admitted on its website, they give the name of her so it doesn't look as though they're trying to phony the thing.
To create high levels of female promiscuity among American wives, Kinsey redefined married women to include any woman that had lived with a man for at least a year, a broad description that could include prostitutes who had lived with their pimps. In fact, prostitutes were a subculture that Kinsey specifically sought out, mixing them in with the regular female population. As a result, Kinsey's report stated that some 50% of American women engaged in premarital sex, while 26% of married women were supposedly involved in adultery. Kinsey went on to report that an incredible 87% of unmarried women were having abortions, while 25% of married wives were also aborting. It was these high percentages, shocking even by today's standards, that would help to legalize abortion in the years that would follow. For decades, Dr. Judith Reisman has argued against what is often referred to as Kinsey's junk science because of its dramatic and devastating impact on American law and society.
Corrections starts to enact all of this into corrections decisions. In the legal profession and law schools, now Kinsey would be taught as part of the legal structure via the American Law Institute Model Penal Code. That ferrets out into the private and public education, becomes our sex education, is in our American Law Review journals. It's found in parole through corrections, state and local, and criminal, civil, family, and juvenile justice. And expert witnesses then from the sex world begin to inform this whole structure. Ladies and gentlemen, we have had a real dirty deal. We have, as that FBI agent said to me, the head of the FBI Behavioral Science Unit, after he saw my work on Kinsey and on Playboy, he said to his sons, "Guys, we have been conned."
Dr. Reisman is not alone in her conclusions, nor was she the first to discover these things. As Reese Committee lawyer Renee Wormser states in his book, the much publicized Kinsey studies base an advocacy of criminal and social reform on the very unscientific material which Dr. Kinsey had collected. Wormser went on to cite psychiatric historian Albert Deutsch, who said of the Kinsey Reports that so startling are its revelations, so contrary to what civilized man has been taught, that they would be unbelievable but for the impressive weight of the scientific agencies backing the survey. Wormser comments saying, "Note how impressive is the word scientific and how false." But he goes on to suggest even more, revealing that, according to the Reese Committee, the postmodern thinking in America today is no mere accident, but has been intentionally created by the elite foundations as part of a greater agenda, one in which the work of Kinsey plays no small part. The Reese Committee wrote that it seems to this committee that there is a strong tendency on the part of many of the social scientists whose research is favored by the major foundations toward the concept that there are no absolutes, that everything, including basic moral law, is subject to change, however fundamental it may have been deemed to be under our Judeo-Christian moral system. The puerile doctrine that change is always necessary has led many of these scientists to believe that there are no longer any inalienable rights. They deem themselves justified, with the support of foundation grants, to label their prejudices as truth and to experiment with society. By far, the most disturbing evidence against the Kinsey Reports is the information pertaining to the sexual behavior of children. This was something noted in the 1950s by Professor Albert Hobbs, who wrote that, according to Kinsey, a child molester may have contributed favorably to a child's later sociosexual development. The child sexual data was more fully exposed by Dr. Judith Reisman in the 1980s, who brought the even more disturbing allegation that Kinsey had trained multiple pedophiles to molest children while using stopwatches to record so-called scientific data.
This man, this Kinsey, had been responsible for the rapes and tortures of hundreds, actually it looks like thousands of children.
Needless to say, the Kinsey Institute today denies Dr. Reisman's allegations. They maintain that all of the child sexual data came from one man, who just happened to keep detailed scientific records of his encounters with children. This lone pedophile theory was developed by Dr. John Bancroft, who became the director of the Kinsey Institute in 1995. Bancroft not only argued that the data came from just one man, but that Kinsey supposedly only got hold of the information years after this pedophile was finished raping kids. This is contrary to Kinsey's own report, in which he admitted to at least 9 pedophiles from whom he obtained information. But in this 1995 interview on Canadian television, Dr. Bancroft says that Kinsey only referred to 3 or 4 pedophiles, and then insists that in reality it was only 1. When questioned about the obvious inconsistency, Bancroft's argument is that Kinsey simply lied about his research. Listen now as this Canadian journalist seems to get uncomfortable during the interview.
Did he make it clear in the report that the conclusions on the sexual capacity of 317 children were based solely on the evidence of one sexual criminal?
No, he suggested that it may have been from 3 or 4. I don't think that is a particularly important difference. Kinsey...
But isn't that conspicuously misleading?
I think he was misleading. I think that he
I'm sorry, you don't think he was misleading? Forgive me?
Yes, I think he was misleading, but I don't think it was misleading of any consequence. He was concerned about his maintaining confidentiality. Throughout his volumes, he tended to avoid drawing attention to any particular individuals.
It's not significant that the conclusions of a study on the sexual responses of children come solely from a man who really has who's a deviant? Doesn't he have a skewed perception of child sexuality?
Well, that was just one type of evidence.
Next, the journalist asks why it took so long to discover that the information came from a single pedophile, rather than multiple pedophiles, as Kinsey had reported. Bancroft's only answer is to say that he worked it out once he became the Kinsey Institute director.
Why did it take so long to set the record straight?
When I got to the Kinsey Institute and these accusations were continuing, some people were expressing, some otherwise reasonable people were beginning to worry about these accusations and saying, well, now, how is it that if he's got information from 3 or 4 men, he can standardize it in such a way that it goes into a table unless somehow or other he's trained these men to make these observations. People were beginning to express that concern, therefore I decided to look more closely at the source of information, and that's when I realized that actually, as far as those tables were concerned, the information all came from this one man who had been collecting this information in an extraordinarily methodical way throughout his life since about 1917.
And you knew of this for how long? That it was that Kinsey was misleading in this?
I worked out that there was one man involved soon after I came to the Kinsey Institute, and shortly after that we issued a press statement from Indiana University making this point clear.
So I'm sorry.
That was at the beginning of September.
What the criticism is also, and it's significant, is that Alfred Kinsey was guilty of academic dishonesty, and if the Institute if the Institute would have been more forthright, the people from the political and religious right wouldn't have the kind of ammunition that they now have to try to not only discredit Kinsey, but the teaching of sex education in schools.
There is no reason to say that Kinsey has been dishonest. He probably had a good reason for obscuring whether it was 1 or 3 men. That is a minor detail.
The minor detail of Kinsey's data may have had a major impact on America's children, especially when one considers that now, decades later, 1 in 4 teenage girls are currently infected with some kind of sexually transmitted disease. And according to the White House Office of National AIDS Policy, in the U.S., it is estimated that 2 young people, aged 13 to 25, are infected with HIV each hour. Is this the devastating fruit of Kinsey's sexual revolution? Furthermore, should Americans trust information about child sexuality from child molesters who were raping kids? As Dr. Bancroft has admitted, Kinsey's pedophile data directly impacts sex education in America.
The specific findings about these children are totally irrelevant to modern sex education.
But where did Kinsey get his information? Did it really come from just one man? The allegedly lone pedophile that Bancroft and the Kinsey Institute point to was known as Mr. Green in Kinsey's research. His real name was Rex King, a man who kept written diaries in which he claimed to have molested more than 800 children. Like most pedophiles, King was never caught and never served a day in prison. The Kinsey Institute usually presents King as a man who simply kept meticulous records and mysteriously came into contact with Kinsey. This same idea was presented in the Hollywood film Kinsey, starring Liam Neeson. But what Kinsey supporters do not reveal is that Mr. Green had been personally trained by Kinsey's mentor, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Something admitted by Paul Gephardt in the 1998 British documentary, Kinsey's Pedophiles.
Kinsey was told about Green by his own mentor in sex research, Dr. Robert Dickinson. Dickinson had collaborated with the pedophile for several years and taught him how to record his child abuse in scientific detail.
He told him how to measure things and time things, and encouraged him to, he knew he was going to do his ordinary behavior anyway. Dickinson couldn't have stopped him from being a pedophile. But he said, at least you ought to do something scientific about it, so it won't be just your jollies, it'll be something worthwhile to science. So he gave him some training by letter and correspondence.
Gephardt has also admitted that Mr. Green's child abuse data played an important role in the Kinsey Reports' view of child sexuality. Gephardt said, Green contributed a fair amount to our knowledge and medicine's knowledge of sexuality in children. We made our point that children are sexual from birth. But the sexuality of these children was determined because, according to Kinsey's interpretation, the children supposedly enjoyed the molestation while it occurred.
If we're talking here about science, you do not ask a rapist if his rape victim enjoyed the rape, and then translate that to the American public as science. Well, nobody minds being raped. They all enjoy it. We asked these experts, and the experts have told us. The experts were the rapists.
Dr. Clarence Tripp, one of Kinsey's original team members, offered this comment on Green's molestation of children.
Well, here's this man with hundreds of contacts. There was never a charge against him. He was never arrested for anything. All the children thought he was wonderful. All the mothers thought he was wonderful. There are two, I suppose, lest you get contradicted, there are two instances in which a young boy or girl, I guess it was, I don't remember, didn't complain. They agreed to the sexual contact, but then they found it very painful and yelled out when it actually took place. This was because they were very young and had small genitalia, and Green was a grown man with enormous genitalia, and there was a fit problem.
The idea that the children enjoyed being molested by Mr. Green is shocking enough, but the suggestion becomes even more appalling with the testimony of Jonathan Gathorne Hardy, a Kinsey biographer who is one of the few people who have been allowed to view Kinsey's private records. Speaking about their practice of keeping files secret, Hardy said, "The Kinsey Institute is nervous people will read the journals. Rex King described having sex with this little girl, this little boy. I think the Kinsey Institute felt right-wing figures would pluck out things. I think they are right to keep them undercover. There are descriptions of King buggering boys nigh on 13 who doesn't enjoy it. I mean, it's quite sort of harsh stuff, some of it." But the most disturbing evidence comes from Kinsey's so-called scientific tables, wherein he describes the sexual responses of young children.
When I was reading Kinsey's book in the first place, and I looked at the tables, table 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and these were tables with ages of children on the left-hand side, and then orgasm in one panel, and timed orgasm, time of orgasm in the next one.
In Kinsey's tables 31 through 34, he documented the timed orgasms of children as young as 2 months old, recording their responses down to the 10th of a second. The findings are so extreme that one child, a 4-year-old, is said to have had 26 orgasms within a 24-hour period. For Dr. Reisman, the obvious question was, where did Kinsey get such information?
And I looked at those charts and graphs. I can't tell you how long it took me to try to process what I was seeing. I said, this is the torture of children.
At the base of Table 31, Kinsey tells us that the data is based on actual observation of 317 males. Then on page 177 of the male volume, Kinsey writes, orgasm is in our records for a female babe of 4 months. But how would anyone recognize such a response in a young child? Kinsey wrote that among pre-adolescent boys and among younger females, orgasm is not so readily recognized, partly because of the lack of ejaculate.
And so I said, what did this man, this Kinsey, call an orgasm? Right, I mean, it's an obvious question, isn't it? I mean, first of all, this was not possible, but second of all, what did he call? Well, I saw he documented it on page 160 and 161 in Kinsey's book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. He described specifically what he called an orgasm amongst these children.
Kinsey defined orgasm for pre-adolescent children with the following description: a gradual and sometimes prolonged build-up to orgasm, which involves still more violent convulsions of the whole body, heavy breathing, groaning, sobbing, or more violent cries, sometimes with an abundance of tears, especially among younger children.
And he said there were 6 categories. He called them 6 categories of orgasm, and he had category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And included in these categories of what he called an orgasm were screaming, writhing in pain, hysterics, especially among younger children. He put that in parentheses, especially among younger children, parentheses. He said that the children had convulsions. Those were his words. He said they fainted. He said they struck the partner. He called it the partner. This is the man who's raping the child. Okay. They struck the partner and tried to get away. And he said that those were all examples for him, of orgasm.
Kinsey made it clear that this data was supplied by adult observers, who were defined as pedophiles by Kinsey's own team members, as you will hear later on. Kinsey wrote, some males suffer excruciating pain and may scream. The males in the present group, by which he meant pre-adolescent boys, become similarly hypersensitive before the arrival of actual orgasm, will fight away from the partner, and may make violent attempts to avoid climax, although, he said, they derive definite pleasure from the situation. Kinsey biographer James H. Jones was a 1998 Pulitzer Prize finalist for his biography on Kinsey. In the Yorkshire documentary, Jones had this to say about Kinsey's description of child orgasm.
If you read those words, what he's talking about is kids who are screaming, kids who are protesting in every way they can the fact that their bodies, that their persons are being violated.
At that point, reading that, I said, the only person who could write that would be, number one, a pedophile or a pederast, because these were boys, was homosexual abuse of boys, and a sadomasochist. That is, the only human being in the world who could call an orgasm something that involved people throwing up, having convulsions, fainting, screaming, crying. The only person who could do that is someone who experienced that themselves. And that had to be a sadomasochist. And the only person who could apply their sadomasochism to an infant and a child would be a pederast, a rapist. And that's what Kinsey did in that book.
Kinsey's own sadomasochistic tendencies have been documented by a number of biographers. James Jones revealed that Kinsey once climbed into a bathtub and circumcised himself with a pocket knife without the benefit of anesthesia. Another account of Kinsey's extreme self-abuse came about when his research was under investigation. Jones reports that after the Rockefeller Foundation withdrew his funding, Kinsey went to a basement, tied one end of a rope to an exposed ceiling pipe and the other end around his scrotum, then stood on a chair and jumped off.
The abuse that he inflicted on his organs, on his sexual organs, were very directly identified in his death. That was orchitis. That was a serious inflammation and disease that he inflicted upon himself that was basically involved in his final death. Now, the attempt to claim that Kinsey died of a heart attack is a perfectly reasonable thing to try to do. It's kind of embarrassing to say that the father of the entire sexual revolution, who has trained all of our sex educators in the United States of America basically, died because he had so abused himself doing the activity that they tell everybody is okay, that he died of this terrible and very painful experience.
If Kinsey's abuse had only been inflicted upon himself, his critics might be less likely to accuse him. But his abuse extended to children, the most precious members of our society. In this image, Kinsey seems to take a demented sort of glee in showing these young children a film of two porcupines engaged in a sexual act. He seems oblivious to the confused and even disturbed looks on the faces of these children. Was it this same lack of concern that enabled Kinsey to support and even encourage the most depraved sexual criminals? The evidence shows that Kinsey was not content to work with merely one pedophile, as Dr. Bancroft and the Kinsey Institute claim. Following the example of his mentor, Dr. Robert Dickinson, Kinsey set out to train his own predators, men who would collect information about what can only be called the sexual torment of children. Dr. Clarence Tripp was Kinsey's photographer who filmed and photographed sex scenes in the attic of Kinsey's home in Bloomington, Indiana. In 1990, Tripp was interviewed on The Phil Donahue Show, along with Dr. Judith Reisman, who appeared to defend her first book exposing Kinsey.
Well, don't look now, but they're attacking Dr. Kinsey again. The book is titled Kinsey, Sex and Fraud, The Indoctrination of a People.
During the show, as Clarence Tripp began to defend Kinsey's research, even Phil Donahue, with his liberal views on sexuality, became uneasy at some of Tripp's bizarre comments about the molestation of children.
We should say that you are the author of The Homosexual Matrix, a book which got quite a positive response from...
But I want to agree with Reisman on one point. I think we really ought to talk about the child stuff before we mix in the
right, well, make your point,
homosexual stuff. You know, we really shouldn't go too fast there. We want to savor that because it is wonderful. It's so delicious what she says. I want to draw you a picture of the image. The image is that the world-famous sex researchers, or Dr. Kinsey alone, it's not quite clear, are in a room and they hover over a young child, less than a year old, and with their fingers or a feather, that's not quite clear, they tickle the genitalia and bring this kid to orgasm, who is screaming and hollering and possibly held down by chains.
And drugged.
It's all too glorious.
Well, make your point. I hope that you don't. You're being sarcastic, but I want to make sure.
I didn't mean to be sarcastic.
You're saying this isn't true, that Dr. Kinsey or his colleagues did not.
This is the man who was with me on Donahue saying, you got to stay with this. It's delicious what she says about what they were doing to the children.
Dr. Reisman refused to go on Donahue unless he would agree to show Kinsey's tables, where the child sex abuse data is presented. Despite knowing about these tables, Donahue repeatedly insisted that no proof existed of child abuse in Kinsey's research. Nevertheless, he did show the data to his audience.
Well, we're going to show.
There.
Now,
now,
what is the point?
You
what is
tell
your
me
point?
what is the point. 5 months old. What is it? I can hardly read it. What's next to that? Number of orgasms. Oh, number of orgasms, 3. Go down to the 4-year-old. Do you see the 4-year-old there?
17, yeah.
There, bottom one.
Yes,
4-year-old, 26 orgasms in 24 hours. Tell me, Phil. Tell me, Phil. Does a baby sleep? Tell me, Phil. Tell me, Phil. Does a baby sleep? Tell me if this is scientific. A baby sleeps for 8 hours?
And
you tell me how you get 26 orgasms for 24 hours.
We've got to be able to get a word in edgewise.
Just a minute, just a minute.
Sounds like a guest for the Donahue show.
And you know what Gebhardt said to me? You know what Dr. Gebhardt said? He wrote me a letter, which I wish you had up there too, in which he said that oral and manual techniques were used on the children. Now, Phil, I'm going to say that once more. I'm going to say that once more. And if I'm wrong, let them sue me. He said oral and manual techniques were used on those children.
The letter that Dr. Reisman refers to was written by Paul Gebhardt on March 11, 1981, in which he attempted to explain where the child sexual data came from. In this letter, he admits that multiple pedophiles were used in collecting information for the Kinsey Reports. Gebhardt writes, "Since sexual experimentation with human infants and children is illegal, we have had to depend upon other sources. Some of these were parents. A few were nursery school owners or teachers. Others were homosexual males interested in older but still prepubertal children. One was a man who had numerous sexual contacts with male and female infants and children, and being of a scientific bent, kept detailed records of each encounter." Gebhardt went on to say that some of these sources have added to their written or verbal reports photographs, and in a few instances, cinema. The techniques involved were self-masturbation by the child, child-child sex play, and adult-child contacts, chiefly manual or oral. Gephardt's letter clearly refutes the lone pedophile theory of Dr. John Bancroft, but fits in perfectly with what Kinsey documented in sexual behavior in the human male. Gephardt's mention that photographs and cinema were sent to Kinsey also explains the discovery made by former Kinsey Institute director June Reinisch in 1984.
This was Newsweek in '84 when June Reinisch said, that the Institute encourages visitors and so forth. And she says, what's her name? Reinisch says that she found a collection of child pornography so distasteful to Reinisch personally, she couldn't bear to look at it, all right? Now, she's not asking where that child pornography came from, right? But some of it was...
Now, she found this at the
Kinsey Institute, yes. Yeah, at the Kinsey Institute. And John Bancroft, who wrote about Kinsey and supported Kinsey for years before he was hired as the head of the Kinsey Institute, right? Who was supposed to be an expert on Kinsey, which was why he was hired by the Kinsey Institute, now suddenly claims that everybody knew all along that these children were being raped by one pedophile. Well, he's the expert on Kinsey. Why didn't he ever write about it before he got hired? Why did he have to go into the Kinsey Institute to look into it if it's all laying out there? He knew that it wasn't a couple of pedophiles, which he said at one point. It wasn't one pedophile, which he said at another point. Kinsey said it was 9 pedophiles. That's what he wrote. And it certainly would have been at least 9, because we now know from Yorkshire Television that Kinsey was working with a group of pedophiles.
There was also a pedophile organization in this country. They cooperated with us, and some of them who were not, of course, not incarcerated, they came and gave us information.
Dr. Reisman believes the pedophile organization mentioned by Gebhardt may have been the nucleus for what would become NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. While child molestation is a crime in any circumstance, the members of NAMBLA claim that their intentions are out of love for the children they molest. Yet this cover of a NAMBLA bulletin, which they called their back-to-school issue, paints quite a different picture. It shows a frightened boy cornered by two adult men who are about to force him into sexual contact, and is more consistent with the information found in the Kinsey Reports, that children are in fact being raped and tormented by the pedophiles who prey upon them. To this day, NAMBLA looks to Alfred Kinsey as their inspiration, saying that gay liberationists in general, and boy lovers in particular, should know Kinsey's work and hold it dear. Implicit in Kinsey is the struggle we fight today.
Well, there's a huge connection between Alfred Kinsey and NAMBLA. In fact, NAMBLA has relied upon Kinsey's research for years. Kinsey tried to make pedophilia seem acceptable.
Kinsey's argument was that it was society's reaction to pedophiles that caused the real trauma of child molestation. Members of NAMBLA will often refer to this quote from Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, where Kinsey wrote that when children are constantly warned by parents and teachers against contacts with adults, they are ready to become hysterical as soon as any older person approaches, or stops and speaks to them in the street, or fondles them. Some of the more experienced students of juvenile problems have come to believe that the emotional reactions of the parents, police officers, and other adults who discover that the child has had such a contact may disturb the child more seriously than the sexual contacts themselves. The current hysteria over sex offenders may very well have serious effects on the ability of many of these children to work out sexual adjustments some years later.
In Kinsey's view, a lot of sex crime was really not crime at all. He seemed to worship sexual experience. I mean, he had a 24/7 obsession with sex long before he attained the position at Indiana University. So for him, all forms of sexual experience, to one degree or another, could have merit that were outside the pale of traditional morality.
Many researchers have come to believe that it was this philosophy that allowed Kinsey and his team to communicate with active child molesters and even train them to record their abuse in a scientific manner. While the Kinsey Institute continues to deny this, further evidence is found from the testimony of Dr. Clarence Tripp on The Phil Donahue Show. Listen carefully as Tripp confirms that there were multiple pedophiles, not just one, and says that they were trained observers that used stopwatches.
I'm going to say that once more, and if I'm wrong, let them sue me. He said oral and manual techniques were used on those children.
Yeah,
what American is going to defend that?
How does C.A. Tripp respond to that?
She's talking about data that came from pedophiles, that he would listen to only pedophiles who were very careful, used stopwatches, knew how to record their things, did careful surveys. And these she resents very much, but they're very important.
So he interviewed people who were known criminals, I assume. Were they in prison at the time?
Oh, certainly not. But they were, in her sense, criminals because they were pedophiles. But they were trained
Oh, in her sense,
observers.
they were criminals because they were pedophiles. They're raping children and they're not criminals. You're going to defend
Nobody
that.
was raping children. What they
what
were
do you
doing...
call sexually, manually, and orally abusing a baby, and you're a bloody pedophile?
We also have an interview that was a phone interview that I have a copy of. It's in my book, between Gebhard and Dr. Muir, who was my editor, in which Gebhard admits that they told the pedophiles to use stopwatches.
The interview Dr. Reisman refers to took place on November 2nd, 1992, between Dr. Gordon Muir and Paul Gebhard. Dr. Muir also appeared on The Donahue Show as the editor of the book, Kinsey, Sex and Fraud. On the show, he confronted Clarence Tripp.
And you're telling me that Kinsey came across in an interview sample of 5,300 people, he found pedophiles who had stopwatches, just happened to have stopwatches, just happened to have all that data handy?
Some 2 years later, in a phone interview, Dr. Muir would pursue a similar line of questioning with Paul Gebhard, one of the original co-authors of the Kinsey Reports, who succeeded Alfred Kinsey as the original director of the Kinsey Institute. Listen carefully how Gebhard admits that there were multiple pedophiles that he and Kinsey worked with, how they actually encouraged some of the adults to molest children, and that it was at the instruction of Kinsey and his team that they used stopwatches.
Table 32.
Yeah, the table's all right, but these all were done with stopwatches necessarily.
It says below table 32, the legend says duration of stimulation before climax. Observations timed with second hand or stopwatch.
So second hand or stopwatch. Okay, well that's, you refreshed my memory. I had no idea that it was used on that many.
Well, my question to you is this. Who did that? Who did the timing?
It was dependent on who it was. Most of it was done by one individual. A man with some scientific training, but not a known scientist. The other cases were done by parents at our suggestion. And let's see, then there were some that were done by nursery school personnel.
Was that at your suggestion too?
Yes. When these people would report to us, they saw childhood sexual activity. We asked them to watch it and take notes, and if possible time it and report back to us.
Some of the stimulation was clearly being done by adults themselves, isn't that correct?
Yes, that was the pedophiles. Or particularly one man, but there were several pedophiles that gave us data.
But since they were all doing the same thing and reporting on the same thing and taking the same measurements, it looks like it was organized ahead of time. Is that right?
No. No, we just simply asked anyone who had any data on childhood sexuality to tell us about it.
Well, what about the cases then, which it says in the book, some of them were followed up for several years to make sure that true orgasm was involved. That looks like prospective planning there.
But not on our part.
You mean pedophiles just took it upon themselves to do follow-up experiments to find out if true orgasms were involved?
No. We had some. Try this again.
At this stage of the interview, Gephardt engages in a bit of wordplay, but listen carefully as Dr. Muir gets to the point with him.
Once we ask people about giving us their observations, we would ask them later too. In other words, if there were some pedophiles who reported their data to us, and if they got in contact with us later, we would then ask them more about it. We follow up on by re-interviewing people occasionally. We call them retakes. I think that's mentioned.
Right, it is. But I mean, what I'm trying to get at was, this sounds like it was a little bit of prospective planning here.
No, we did not plan and organize any Masters and Johnson type experiments with children, period. Never did.
So, do pedophiles normally go around with stopwatches?
They do if we tell them that we're interested in it, but this isn't a plan on our part. They do if we tell them that we're interested in it.
I want to know who these children are, how their parents were involved, and have we talked to those children now as adults?
When I wrote to the Kinsey Institute and I asked What about these children? They just casually wrote me back. Gebhardt casually wrote me back that, well, we never had any follow-up on these children. It was too expensive, he said, or just impossible. What does he mean there's never been a follow-up? You just talked about men who are raping children, at least 317 children. Now we're looking at, it comes up to maybe 2,035 at minimum, probably. The youngest 2 months of age, and you call yourselves, quote unquote, scientists, and you've never even followed up. That's a lie. There's got to be some information, and if it was good information, if they had found out that these children were completely unharmed, lived fine lives, we would know about it. They would have passed that information on to us so fast.
Many of the children abused by Kinsey's pedophiles probably had no idea that they were part of a government-sponsored study, most likely living out their lives in suffering and confusion about what had happened to them. But when the Family Research Council released its documentary, The Children of Table 34, the haunting image of a stopwatch sparked the memory of a woman who calls herself Esther White.
My grandfather molested me when I was around 4. And he never did again. But he went to Indiana University to get his teaching certificate. And he took biology while he was there. And so I'm assuming that he probably met Kinsey there because the whole university was involved in his research.
As a child, Esther says she was taken by her father and grandfather to meet with Alfred Kinsey and to be interviewed by him. But the real purpose of that meeting would be a mystery for years to come.
I didn't really know, I didn't connect at all until I read Judith Reisman's writings. Especially when it came to the video that she did where they showed a stopwatch. And that was the key. I realized, yes, that was what was going on.
Now in her 70s, her desire is to remain as anonymous as possible out of consideration for her family. Esther White is her assumed name.
How old were you when you met Dr. Alfred Kinsey?
It was probably in 1943 or so, 43 or 44. I was born in 34. My father was very excited about taking me there to meet Dr. Kinsey. I didn't know who he was. All I knew was that my dad was very excited about taking me there for an interview. And he was instructing me that I was to be very nice to this man and answer him. He told me they would ask me about my family and whether I loved my family and so forth. So when we got there, it was at my grandfather's and great-grandmother's house. And Mr. Kinsey and his 2 colleagues were late in getting there because it was wintertime. And he was doing a seminar at Ohio State University. This was in Columbus, Ohio. And when he came, he was in very much of a rush because they were so late. And he kneeled down in front of me and asked me questions about whether I loved my daddy, whether I loved my family. And of course I said yes, because I did. I loved my family. And the interview was very short. There was a man with him that had a clipboard who was taking down my answers to the questions. I can't remember all the questions he asked, but it was probably a 5 or 10 minute interview. And just before they left, my grandfather said, "What about the check?" And he says, "Oh yes, I almost forgot."
Who said that, Kinsey?
Kinsey said that. And so my grandfather took a check from him, and Kinsey said, "I made it out to both of you because I didn't know which one was going to get the money."
The disturbing implication is that Alfred Kinsey used taxpayer money via the Rockefeller Foundation to finance pedophiles who were actively molesting children.
Why would he pay them? For what?
At the time, I didn't know for what. Many years later, I had found out that my dad had actually helped Alfred Kinsey do research for his book.
Esther's own father had been molesting her for years and sending information to the Kinsey Institute. When Kinsey's book, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, was released, her father showed her a copy and boasted that he had helped to write it. At the time, she did not know what he meant.
He gave me a copy of the book in 1947, but it was a pre-edition signed by somebody, autographed by somebody, and I don't remember who, but my father gave me the book and said that he helped Alfred Kinsey research on the book, and that it was going to change the way the world looked at sexuality.
How old were you when your father first began to molest you?
I was probably around 6, maybe 7. I couldn't tell you exactly.
Do you ever remember your father molesting you with a stopwatch?
Yes.
And then would he record information?
There were papers on the dresser, and I saw one of the papers one day, and it had a lot of questions on it. And there were little boxes to check those things off when those things were done. And it was talking about orgasm. I didn't know what that word meant, but at the time. And when I asked him what that word meant, when I saw it on the paper, he grabbed the paper, put it in a brown envelope, and he said that he was late in sending this in. And he put it in this big brown envelope.
Esther's revealing testimony confirms Paul Gephardt's statement that Kinsey worked with parents who sent him child abuse data. She was also interviewed years ago by British filmmaker Tim Tate, who directed the documentary Kinsey's Pedophiles.
Esther White, for what it's worth, swore what's called a statutory declaration here. She swore on oath that the information she gave was true and to the best of her recollection, and so did her mother.
We asked Esther to give us her opinion about the Kinseyan philosophy that children are sexual from birth.
Children are not sexual from birth. They are obedient to whomever is over them. In my case, it was my father. You honored your mother and your father. You obeyed what they said. You did what they said. That's the reason I was silent for so many years. I was told not to tell my mother that this was normal, and all the other little girls and boys were doing this too. So this was not a rare thing at all. They just didn't talk about it. So I was made to believe that I was sexual, but I wasn't. I hated it. I cried, I had convulsions, but that was totally ignored.
She's heartbroken about the life that she lived because of her abuse at the hands of her father and grandfather, who were working for Kinsey and sending material to him. There are others out there like that. Bancroft said he knew there were, and he was afraid they were going to show up. He wasn't talking about one pedophile when he said he was afraid that the children of these pedophiles would show up. He was talking about a lot of people who were damaged, and he knew it. And the Kinsey Institute knows it, and Indiana University knows it, and they've always known it.
Kinsey would have done business with the devil if it helped her research, and this is true.
I view Kinsey as one of the most treasonous Americans in human history.
The charge of treason might sound a bit extreme, but the evidence shows that Kinsey's desire to document the most depraved sexual behavior led him to work with a man who seemed to personify evil itself, a Nazi pedophile named Dr. Fritz von Balusek.
Dr. von Balusek was a Nazi officer, Gestapo, member of the Gestapo, one of the original Nazis, by the way, joined the party very early. He was in charge of a Polish town, and he was a pedophile.
Years after the war, von Balusek was arrested and put on trial for the murder of a 10-year-old girl who had been found naked and throttled on a piece of wasteland. The German authorities suspected von Balusek of the crime because the same girl had been listed among several hundred children he had raped, the details of which he had recorded in his pseudo-scientific diaries. The German newspapers called him the most important pedophile in the criminal history of Berlin. During the war, von Balusek used his authority as a Nazi officer to fulfill his pedophile desires. The full number of children he abused and ultimately murdered is still unknown.
When he was arrested for rape of many children, but also possible murder of a little girl, all of the German newspapers spoke about this on the headlines. It was in the headlines of every newspaper in Germany.
During the war, von Balusek was the commandant of the Polish town of Jędrzejów. There he threatened the children with certain death if they refused his sexual desires. What he recorded in his diaries of how he treated these children was so criminal that during his trial, the judge cried out, quote, "This is no longer human."
He had told the children that it was either the smokestacks or it was him. And it turned out that all the children ended up apparently in the smokestacks anyway. Post-World War II, he was highly placed in civic government, and he was arrested for this possible murder and being investigated. And in the process, they found that he had been corresponding extensively with Kinsey, that Dr. Kinsey had warned him to be aware and careful of the authorities so he shouldn't get caught.
The German authorities learned that von Balusek and Kinsey had a working relationship, and that Dr. Kinsey was well aware of the vicious abuse the Nazi pedophile was inflicting upon innocent children. At his trial, the judge said to von Balusek, "I got the impression that you got to the children in order to impress Kinsey and to deliver him material." To which von Balusek replied, "Kinsey himself asked me for that."
The German press was outraged, and the judge was outraged.
The judge went on to say, instead of answering his sordid letters, the strange American scholar should have rather made sure that Mr. von Balusek was put behind bars. The German press reported that Kinsey's letters to the Nazi contained warnings to watch out or be careful of getting caught. They wrote that in his diaries, von Balusek stuck in the letters from the sex researcher Kinsey, in which he'd been encouraged to continue his research. He had also started relationships to expand his researches. One shivers to think of the lengths he went to. At some point, the German authorities tried to get hold of information on von Balusek from the Kinsey Institute.
The Kinsey Institute, even though they knew they were dealing with a Nazi and a paedophile, when the German authorities wanted, for the purposes of this murder investigation, wanted to get hold of that information, the Kinsey Institute refused, and Gebhardt said to me, and indeed on camera, that they would have destroyed any evidence before they handed it over to the police.
Paul Gebhardt said of this event that the FBI put pressure on Kinsey to reveal the guy's sexual diary, but Kinsey said absolutely not. Gebhardt went on to say the poor pedophile had his reputation destroyed, finally quit corresponding with us. While German media documented the story heavily, the American press, under the powerful influence of the tax-exempt foundations, gave almost no attention to the story, even though Kinsey's research, which had turned the country upside down, was almost certainly based in part on the sexual abuse done by a Nazi pedophile during the Second World War. It is entirely likely that von Balusek's letters to Kinsey can still be found in the records of the Kinsey Institute even today. Kinsey's willingness to work with the devil at one point seemed to take on a very literal meaning.
One of the interesting things I found several years ago in researching the Satanist Aleister Crowley was the influence that he has had on so many people here in the United States of America. And one of the men that he had influenced was Alfred Kinsey.
After publishing his male and female reports, Kinsey began to travel abroad and study sexuality in foreign countries. In his book, Kinsey co-author Wardell Pomeroy wrote that Kinsey went looking for a prized item, the diaries of Aleister Crowley.
Crowley died just a year before Kinsey's book came out.
Crowley was a famous and highly controversial British occultist in the early part of the 20th century. His sexual exploits in bizarre and sometimes deadly satanic rituals had been exposed in the London newspapers.
He also talked about taking a virgin and having sexual relations with her, and then upon a climax to actually murder her, cut her in 6 pieces, and put the names of the various demon gods on those 6 limbs, those 6 parts of her body.
Taking the name for the Antichrist in the Bible, Crowley called himself the Beast 666. His famous saying was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law," by which he justified all forms of immorality.
Crowley had a sex temple and had practiced group sex and orgies and what have you, and so-called sex magic. Crowley was into pedophilia. He was into justifying his pedophilia. In fact, he had said, "Let me seduce the boys of England." He wanted to seduce them, and then he starts talking about sodomy and it should be acceptable. So, I mean, it was quite shocking, especially back then.
Pomeroy wrote that Crowley was called by Lord Douglas the wickedest man who ever lived, and his sexual history alone was enough to earn him the title he gloried in, the Beast. Crowley kept a diary up to his death. 2 weeks after Kinsey tracked down these papers in England, he found himself in the temple that the Beast had founded in Sicily. Kinsey is pictured here inside Crowley's temple, known as the Abbey Thelema, where he performed his satanic rituals. On the wall is a picture of Crowley himself, while across from Kinsey is another man named Kenneth Anger. Anger was a close acquaintance who appeared in some of Kinsey's sex films, made in the attic of his Bloomington home. As an avant-garde filmmaker, Anger was deeply involved in the occult. He directed films with titles such as Lucifer Rising and The Invocation of My Demon Brother.
Kenneth Anger is a co-founder of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, and Kenneth Anger also was, had a penchant for younger men, for sure. Bobby Beausoleil was his live-in boyfriend. That's the same Bobby Beausoleil that committed the first murder, killing Hinman for Charles Manson. That was his live-in boyfriend. He played Lucifer in one of his occult movies that extolled the virtues of Aleister Crowley's magic and what have you.